supposed to keep.
Hello and welcome everyone to another episode of This is Revolution podcast. This episode is a little different than we usually do. This is a pre-recorded episode we're doing today because this is a guest we've wanted to have for some time on the show. And Pascal has been talking about this probably since we started doing the show together. We wanted to get this gentleman on. So we had an opportunity to get him on. Pascal was like, "Jay, can we do the pre-record things?" So figured it out. So this is pre-recorded. So if you are asking questions in the chat and we don't respond, you don't see me giggle to the hilarious things that you people say, that is why. So without any further ado, let me bring in my co-host, my homie, my dog, Mr. Pascal Roper. This new setup is not ergonomically correct. I probably need to be sitting down to do everything, but then you could see the child's bed behind me, and that's just not cool.
That's not going to cut it.
It's the new digs. The time is of the essence. So let's, Pascal, do you want to, actually, before we even play the clip for today, which you haven't seen, do you want to give us a little bit about what we're going to talk about today?
Today we're going to be talking about Black America as the reserve army of labor, and what is the Marxist response? The reserve army of labor basically is a Marxist theory that Black people suffer economically in American capitalism because they're disproportionately relegated to the surplus labor that is meant to be redundant in the United States, and all of the social and economic and various ills that befall the Black community is a consequence of disproportionately being relegated to that reserve army of labor, which, according to neoliberal capitalists like Milton Friedman, who would call the natural rate of unemployment, or they call it NAIRU.
It makes it sound so nice and common, that Friedman. Well, before we bring our guest in, let's play this clip and get our guest fired up for the show.
Socialism hasn't gone anywhere. It has been betrayed, yes. But betrayal doesn't mean collapse. Perhaps they get confused because at least Judas had the dignity after betraying Christianity to hang himself. Gorbachev is still running around the world picking up pieces of silver. Must be clear here and not confused. I'm a socialist. One other thing I must tell you now. They confuse people about socialism. Brother the other day said, "I ain't no socialist." I said, "Why not, brother?" He said, "Because it's a white thing." I said, "Oh, really?"
From the end of the plantation slave economy in America, large numbers of Black workers have existed in economic precarity. What does it mean to have Black workers disproportionately relegated to the reserve army of labor in a capitalist society? What are Marxist remedies to this problem? We'll ask these questions and more. This is Revolution.
You see, Europe tries to make believe that everything that comes out of the world comes out of Europe. I told the man, I said, "Socialism ain't no white thing." He said, "Yes, it is." He said, "Karl Marx discovered it." I told him, "Karl Marx never discovered socialism. He cannot." You call the laws of gravity Newton's laws. I'm sure there's a mnemonic device to help you on your quizzes. But you certainly cannot believe that Isaac Newton can found that a body falls at the rate of 32 feet per second squared per second squared. He can't find this. He can't discover it. He cannot invent this. He can only observe it and record it, discover the law. If I'm sitting in Timbuktu in Africa and I've never heard of Sir Isaac Newton and I'm conducting any experiments with gravity, I will come to the same conclusion that he does. A body in motion tends to stay in motion unless stopped by an outside force. He cannot invent this. He can only observe it and record it. Karl Marx did not invent socialism. If I'm sitting in Libya, in the desert, and I'm doing any research with capital and labor without ever having heard of Karl Marx, I will come to the same conclusion that he did. That any time capital seeks to dominate labor, there'll be a ruthless, uncompromising struggle on the part of labor until it comes to crush capital and dominate it. This is a fact. My history demonstrates that. We came here as chattel slaves for centuries. We fought and fought and fought until we crushed it. Now we're just slave of the wage, and now we've got to rise up and crush that one. That's to declare that Karl Marx didn't invent socialism. It's there for all to see. Karl Marx's great contribution to the world was in the area of historical materialism and dialectical materialism, something you need to know if you know about socialism. But since you don't know about socialism, you don't even know the words. And not only does the enemy keep you ignorant, you stay ignorant. You won't ever go read a book about socialism. Why read a book about socialism? They already told me in my class it ain't no good. You will not even read a book about socialism. Why, you don't even read a book about your history. We come to inspire you to learn. We come to tell you that when you come to serve a people, you must know as much as you can. The more you know, the better able you are to serve the people.
How'd you like that?
That was very, very good. I like it.
Well, you want to introduce our guest?
Today's guest is the world-renowned economist, Marxist economist, scholar of political economy, professor and teacher, intellectual and writer, Professor Richard Wolff.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here.
We're very happy. We're very happy to have you. That excerpt from Kwame Ture was taken from a 1992 speech he gave at Florida International University.
It's very close to where I am.
You should have went.
I wasn't living in Florida then.
I don't want to hear your excuses.
Jason, do you have a quote you wanted to read?
I do. So to get ready for this show, Pascal found a really interesting essay by a gentleman named Ken Lawrence. I also was reading this book right here, The Civil War in the United States, Karl Marx and Frederick Engels. It's a series of their correspondence and actually a lot of the first volume of Capital. He talks about the Civil War and his thoughts on the Civil War. But here, throughout Karl Marx's long career as philosopher, historian, social critic, and revolutionary, he considered the enslavement of African people in America to be a fundamental aspect of rising capitalism, not only in the New World, but in Europe as well. As early as 1847, Marx made the following forceful observation: direct slavery is just as much the pivot of bourgeoisie industry as machinery, credits, etc. Without slavery, you have no cotton. Without cotton, you have no modern industry. It is slavery that has given the colonies their value. It is the colonies that have created world trade, and it is world trade that is the precondition of large-scale industry. Thus, slavery is an economic category of the greatest importance. Without slavery, North America, the roost progressive of countries, would be transformed into a patriarchal country. Wipe out North America from the map of the world, and you will have anarchy, the complete decay of modern commerce and civilization. Cause slavery to disappear, and you will have wiped America off the map of nations. Thus, slavery, because it is an economic category, has always existed among the institutions of peoples. Modern nations have been able to disguise slavery in their own countries, but they have imposed it without disguise upon the new world.
Excellent quote. I think that kind of defeats the notion that Karl Marx didn't care about slavery or the issues of race and capitalism. So, Professor Wolff, we're going to get right to the heart of the matter here. The thesis of our show today is about the role of race in American and even international capitalism. And the premise of the thesis is that Black America fulfills its position in this country as being disproportionately the reserve army of labor. One, can you tell our audience, do you agree with this thesis? And what exactly does that mean in layman's terms for, the average black American, or for America in general?
Well, thank you very much again for having me on the program. I do agree with the observation, and I think I can explain it in ways that will make, if anything, the case even stronger. So let me begin by saying that not only was the whole development of modern capitalism fundamentally started around the cotton textile manufacture. There would be no British Empire without cotton textile manufacture. First, the British Empire destroyed the cotton textile industry of India when it subjected India to its colonial domination. Then it developed cotton manufacture at home in England as a competitor to the now destroyed cotton industry in India. But in order for England to succeed in producing the cotton that India had outproduced for centuries before that, it had to solve a problem. There's no way on the cold, wet island of England that cotton would grow. So therefore, England had to find some way to secure regular supplies of cotton, or else the entire industrial development of England, which was the home of capitalism at that time, would have been stopped in its tracks. And again, to make a long story short, both in Egypt, where the British planted cotton, that was a colony of theirs at the time, and in what became the United States, likewise a colony of theirs, they implanted cotton. But in the United States, having ethnically cleansed the indigenous population, there was no way they could grow the cotton that the soil allowed and that the climate allowed and that the rainfall allowed without solving the labor problem. There was no way they could bring English citizens or anybody else at that time to the southern states to perform the crucial act, the labor, without which there is no cotton. And that problem was solved by African slavery. That was the key missing element. There was no way for them to deal with that problem that they could imagine, so they decided to use the slavery of the African people, transported across the ocean to North America to produce the cotton, which was then shipped to England, manufactured into cotton cloth and textiles, allowing the British Empire to raise the money needed for Britain to be the leading power of capitalism in the 18th and most of the 19th century. Here's the irony, though. It's still true. In a way I'm about to describe, Africans, although now African Americans, continue to play a crucial linchpin role in Western capitalism in general, but in American capitalism in particular. And let me explain as quickly as I can. Capitalism as a system has a fundamental problem. It is unstable. What do I mean? Every 4 to 7 years, wherever capitalism has settled in as the economic system, which began in England in the 17th century and then spread to the world as it is today. Whenever and wherever capitalism settled, every 4 to 7 years, it had a downturn. We have many words for this: downturn, crash, crisis, recession, depression. I could go on. We have all these words because it's a regular recurrence. It's a terrible flaw in the system. Every 4 to 7 years, suddenly, people are thrown out of work. Not because of the quality of the work they do. It's just as good today as it was last month, but they're fired today. Why? Because the employer can't sell the stuff suddenly, so the employer fires them suddenly. And of course, since people get fired, they have no income. If they have no income, they can't buy food and clothing the way they used to, which means the employer of the people producing food and clothing lays off his employees, and it becomes the spiral into the great recessions, depressions, business cycle. That's the polite term for it, that capitalism has struggled with. Over and over again, working class people looked at this system, which periodically threw millions of them out of work, and they opposed it. They were critical. They were angry at their losses. If they had put down money to buy a home, being thrown out of work meant they couldn't pay their mortgage. They couldn't take care of their family. They couldn't plan the education for their children if they wanted to, and so on. It's a terrible, terrible quality. And by the way, capitalism knows that. Capitalism knows it's threatened by its own instability. It's always worried that the next downturn will turn off so many people that the system itself will become questionable, challenged, overthrown. It's a very, very important thing, and they've tried. Heaven knows they've tried to overcome it over and over, this and that. The best minds in the best universities trying to figure out how can we hold on to a capitalism but get rid of this cycle instability that threatens us all. They've never succeeded. Their greatest effort, a British economist named John Maynard Keynes, in the depths of the Depression of the 1930s, tried to develop a whole new economics, which was for a while used, but it didn't work either. And we're as haunted by capitalism's downturns today as we were 20, 50, 100 years ago.
I do want to ask you a quick question in regards to Keynes. Do you think we're going to see with this new administration a little bit more Keynesianism in things like the infrastructure bill, but maybe mixed in with a little bit of good old neoliberalism?
Absolutely. You're seeing already, as the wind changes, as the neoliberal period comes to an end, having been harshly shocked first by the great crash of 2008 and 9, and now again, barely 10 years later, with the great crash of 2020 and 2021. This system has not only not overcome its crises, its cycles, they're getting worse. So absolutely, you're right. There will be more and more recovery of Keynes, reapplication of Keynes, in the hope that this time maybe it'll work. But so far, nothing has. Every 4 to 7 years, the system crashes. And now here comes the important part about where the African American working class fits. If you allow the capitalist instability to threaten your entire working class, I think we would have seen successful revolutions against capitalism many, many years ago. Think of it. Every 4 to 7 years, there's a crash. If you are at risk by being a worker, that this one will get you, or even if you get through this next one, the one after that will get you, assuming a normal lifespan, you've got 8 to 10 of these things to go through in your lifetime. And the odds are one or the other of them is going to get you losing your job, maybe losing your home, disrupting your family, being forced to move, interrupting your education, and all of the horrible consequences that come from being without work, especially for long periods of time. So if capitalism can't solve its instability, and it hasn't been able to, then it is in an existential crisis. That is, it's in a situation where it is threatening the working class all the time. You have to worry, will it come next year? Even if I don't get hit with it next year, will the one 4 years later? How do I buy a car with the car payments I have to make, or a home with the home payments I have to make, or move my family and disrupt my teenagers from their high school, and on and on and on? The working class would have revolted against that kind of instability. When I teach my classes and I get to explain this, I lean across the podium to my students and I let a kind of silence settle in. And then I say to them, if you lived with a roommate as unstable as capitalism, you would have moved out long ago. So now here comes the punchline. How could capitalism survive given that it can't solve its instability problem and given that the working class as a whole won't tolerate it? Here is the solution found in the United States, and I'll show you how similarly in other countries. But in the United States, the solution was the following: segregate out a portion of the working class. And in this country, that was primarily African Americans. Make the instability focus on them. When the downturn comes, they should be the first fired. When the economy picks up again, well, then they can be the last hired. They're the slack in the economy. You can now go to the white worker and you can say to him or her, you don't have to worry about capitalism's instability. You've got an insurance policy. You're not the one that's going to lose the job. Somebody else is going to play that role. And then the last step in this horrible, really horrible social catastrophe, once you've worked that out, once you make sure that with each cycle it whacks the African American community harder, sooner, and for longer than the whites, teach the whites that this happens to the Black community not because of capitalism's instability, but of course something wrong with the African American people. They are to blame for the unemployment role they are required to play. But here's
cultural failures.
That's right. There's something in their mental makeup. There's something in their family structure. You know, all the efforts that have been made. Basically, this is a game we used to call blaming the victim when you have this kind of situation. But you know, in France, in Germany, and in those other countries, they solved the same problem in pretty much the same way. Let me give you an example. In France, when the economy goes up, things are good. They bring in waves of North Africans, Arab people from Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria, all of that area, plus an increasing number of Black Africans from south of the Sahara. They bring them in. When the capitalist downturn comes, they throw them out. They are referred to as guest workers. And the system handles the problem by ejecting them. Here in the United States, something like that was thought about at various points in American history.
The Bracero program in the
That's
40s.
right, with Mexicans and Central Americans. But for historical reasons, you had a people here who you couldn't kind of push out. And if you did and pushed them back to Africa, well, then they wouldn't be easily coming in and out. So you decided leave them here and make them, I call it the shock absorber. The African American community is the economic shock absorber. Every time capitalism hits an economic downturn bump, it offloads all of the costs, all of the burdens, all of the anxieties that it possibly can onto the African American community, and thereby can go to the white working class and say, don't be angry against capitalism because it won't whack you. It's going to go. And by the way, women, white and black women, are also part of this, because the women could be brought out of the household when things were good and stuck right back in when the system turned down. So for me, the way I would amend or bring up to date, if you like, the Marxian argument is that African Americans were not only the people hired on the upswing without having to pay higher wages because they were already desperate since they were unemployed, but that even more powerfully, they were assigned the role of shock absorber and then the final indignity, the shock absorber role that somebody has to play in capitalism, was assigned to the African American community and then blamed on them as if they had some reason. Nobody in the Black African American community wants to be the shock absorber. Nobody in their right mind, white or black, wants that. This has been a structural, institutional way of coping with a failure of capitalism to overcome this instability, which has roiled it every few years without exception.
What is so transparently obvious about what you're saying is that even though African Americans are disproportionately used as the shock absorber, the numbers of white people who are poor are much greater in aggregate than the number of blacks, because white people are a larger part of the population. But in the context of the psychology or the ideological superstructure, if you will, of American capitalism, some people would actually, I've heard immigrants say, there's no such thing as poor white people, because the perception is that poverty is basically relegated to being black.
Or people of color, right?
Right, and that was done in part, at least the way I read American history, that was done in part because the people at the top who don't want to pay the taxes that would be needed to fund social programs for poor white people or low-income white people, if you put them together with the African Americans in this country, that's a majority. That's politically dangerous. You need to persuade white people not to make the logical alliance with African Americans. And the way you do that is portray social programs as something peculiarly black, peculiarly African American, because then you can get support from white people to be critical or hostile or not sympathetic to social programs because they think it's for them, not for us. And that's a very important way to keep this game going.
Even though more whites per capita in terms of numbers need those social programs.
Absolutely. Look, my reading of America right now, you have a really rapid increase in the last 20, 30 years of white, put aside for a moment the African American, white working class people are losing their jobs, losing their promotions, losing their benefits. All of that crap about the big middle class and the American dream is out of reach. They are furious. This was not supposed to happen. They were given that insurance policy. That's what black people or Hispanic people, they have that problem. You don't, because you're white, but the system is now kicking them right in the nose too, and they're furious They've been betrayed. They've been look, without that, there'd be no Donald Trump. That's his.
I
That's
agree
who he
wholeheartedly.
belongs to. That's his group. He figured out how to cash in on the bitterness of those white people who had been sold a bill of goods that the problem of poverty was something peculiarly black. They're forced now to learn it's got nothing to do with black, Jack. It's just as much coming down the road to kick you in the rear end. And they are outraged. And they don't want to hear from conventional politicians this or that. They want something different. And Mr. Trump, by being vulgar and ugly and right out there with his crap, he was at least different. And those people, look, what was their choice? The irony was it was either Trump or Bernie Sanders. And Bernie Sanders still scares them. So they went for Mr. Trump. The wind changes, those people will vote for Bernie.
I agree. I do want to bring it back to the Great Society programs. When you brought up these race first programs that definitely come out of the Johnson administration.
Yep.
When that was going on, as Preston Smith calls the racial democracy, what was your take when those programs were being implemented in the mid to late 60s? And we started to see a burgeoning black middle class that definitely benefited from these programs that we talk about quite a bit on this show. What was your take when you were seeing that happen at the time?
I thought it was politically, for us as leftists, disastrous, because what it was doing was saying to the mass of white people who have been troubled for a long time, they don't get a good deal in this capitalist system. I'm talking about millions and millions of white working class people. This was for them a sign that the folks at the top were now uninterested in them. And they were going to help the black people rather than them. And all of the racism and all of the ugly history of race relations in this country was now mobilizable. You could have the right wingers come in and say, go against the liberals in Washington, the Kennedy people, the Johnson people, all of them, because they are helping other people. They don't care about you. And this is a very, very dangerous thing. I remember getting together with other people and saying, the way to help African Americans overcome the discrimination and the injustice that has been heaped on them throughout the history of this country is to make a program of full employment for everybody. Do not allow the advance of one part of the working class to be organized and set up at the expense of the other part, because that's the divide and conquer. You allow that to happen, you will not be able to get the solidarity that you need. By the way, that's what the CP did before World War II. That's how they, black and white unite for fight, to fight. Mm-hmm. That was the slogan, and they were right about that. That can be accomplished, and not out of some abstract notion that we should all be good together, which I believe in, but that's not the issue. The issue is a strategic objective not to allow race to be used in all of the subtle ways to split the working class. And that we on the left in this country, we have not figured out how to do that.
Well, here's a question for both of you. Sorry to cut you off, Pascal, but I do want to get your opinion on this as well. Do you think, and this is to both of you, do you think then that the backlash to those programs gives us the rise of the Goldwater conservative movement and therefore the rise of Reagan?
I think that type of rhetoric was used as a justification. As a matter of fact, there is an infamous video of Ronald Reagan's, I believe his campaign aide, I forget the name of the gentleman who's caught basically saying that the Southern strategy, how you go from saying the N-word first.
It was Nixon's Ehrlichman.
you go saying the N word first, but because you can't say the N word, then you say busing, and then you say welfare, you say XYZ. Even though you can't say the N word, still cutting those programs are going to disproportionately harm the black community, even if that may or may not be the goal. But you got to readjust the way in which you literally Lee Atwater. It was Lee Atwater making those statements in a video, basically saying that you got to use that the new way, because you can't say the N word anymore, but you got to find a way to create policy that disproportionately hurts the black community. So I think that there definitely was a relationship between the rise of those racial democracy or race first policies. But I would also make the argument that those race first policies did create an increase of a black middle class, but because the black community was coming out of sharecropping and domestic labor in the Jim Crow era into deindustrialization, particularly in urban environments, it proliferated the economic instability of the black poor and working class, and you started to see a proliferation of those communities, and they were only met with mass incarceration, increase of drug proliferation, increase of family breakdown, because as Professor Wolff would agree, that it's not the culture and the social failure that causes the relegation to the reserve army of labor. It's the relegation of the reserve army of labor that causes the social dislocation that keeps the perpetual cycle going over and over and over again, that creates a metastasizing of the number of blacks in the reserve army of labor over time. So,
yeah, I agree. We're right together on this. I would only add that there weren't enough of the black middle class. You developed one, but it wasn't enough. It was crystal clear to the people at the top that the vast bulk of the African American community was not about to be lifted up into any middle class. That wasn't going to happen. So the question was, what do you do with them, especially as the United States, and this is very important, peaks. The peak of the United States economic miracle, let's call it, that happens towards the end of the 20th century, this 1970s and 80s and 90s. We're on the downslide now. That's a very different situation. Before that, for a century, this was an economy going up, and you could sustain the illusion that somehow economic growth would trickle down and help even those at the bottom. When you're not in that anywhere, in that situation, and when you can't even make it up that you are, then you have to face, well, what are we then going to do if we can't sell the mass of poor that they're going to get rich? If they're learning that they ain't gonna, that the next generation be lucky to live as well as we have in this one, you've got a whole new problem, and you better have drugs and you better fill up your jails, because otherwise you're going to have an explosion in your communities here. And if you do that to the whites, which they were already beginning to do then and have been doing steadily since, then you have the worst of all possible worlds. The mixture of an explosion in the African American community together with a very similarly rooted explosion in the white community. And then you're back to the danger that somebody, some great leader, white or black, will figure out how to put these two explosions together. And then you're in very, very deep doo-doo.
Yeah, Jason wanted to mention that John Ehrlichman was the one who basically was arguing that Nixon used the war on drugs to basically neutralize the political ramifications of the radicalism of the black community in the late 1960s, and also the quote-unquote left or hippies. So he used that as a means. But I would also argue that it was a justification to increase what we all know happens to the reserve army of labor. Where are they disproportionately housed? In prison. Prison, basically, in a capitalist society, works the functioning of housing and demobilizing the reserve army of labor so they cannot become radicalized. Am I correct or incorrect, Professor Wolff?
Absolutely. If you can't, look, If you can't send them out of the country, if they're not just across the Mediterranean so you can ship them back to Tunisia by paying off a few politicians there, if you can't find work for them, you have to immobilize them as a potential revolutionary force. Drugs and prison play that role. And they're doing it now, by the way, increasingly with white people. That's why there's all this opioid catastrophe discussion.
And they're getting king guys that are, manufacturing meth in the bathtub are getting kingpin drug sentences and getting put under the jail in the middle of the country, which is kind of a phenomenon that people don't talk about, which, you could say is maybe one of the failures of Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, which I think is a good starting point of a conversation, but even she wouldn't tell you it is not the definitive book on incarceration. I do want to get back to Karl Marx. Marx was a fan of Lincoln, and actually, maybe wrongly, Andrew Johnson, because they came from, as he put it, working class backgrounds. And I will ask you, learned men, this question. You guys will forget more about U.S. history than I will ever learn. Didn't Lincoln try to send black people back
to Liberia, to Africa? They wanted to think about doing it to Haiti too.
Yeah. The anxiety in America, it's one of the untold stories, but the anxiety in the United States represented by the revolution of Toussaint Louverture in Haiti, don't ever underestimate that. That was a demonstration to the whole world that African people here in the Western Hemisphere could get it together and defeat a place like France, make a revolution, succeed, organize a government, organize an army. This was the worst nightmare imaginable. I don't think you can make sense of the peculiar hostility and oppression of Haitians, right down to that picture last week of those Border Patrol people hassling the Haitian refugees in Texas. Haiti represents a symbolic reminder of how things could be very, very different from the way they are. And I think that you see that all through American history.
As a Haitian American, I'm very glad to hear you say that, Professor Wolff.
I forgot you guys both speak French too.
My father was born in France. I've spoken French since I've been a child.
Alors tu parles français très bien.
Oui, c'est à cause de mon père qui est né en France, à la ville de Metz, à l'Alsace. Nous sommes une famille alsacienne.
Ah, c'est vrai. Ah bon. Logiquement, je parle français parce que mes parents sont haïtiens.
And this is where I go off screen.
We're not going to keep speaking in French. But Professor Wolff,
the reason I think this is so important is that it can be a teaching tool. It can help African Americans and white workers understand literally, and not in some abstract way, that capitalism has treated them in very particular ways for its own reproduction. That it's not in it for them. They're not split because of them. They are not plunged into the misery of drugs or prison or being the shock absorber, periodic unemployment because of something about them. It really, nobody cares about them as a particular group. This is the solution to an existential problem of capitalism. Capitalism is their problem. And what I want is to be able to come up with the language, with the imagery, with the symbols that will get that message across, not least because one of its corollaries, one of its implications is the logic of black and white getting together to get rid of a system that treats them this way.
Well, the irony of what you're saying, we're going to get into some controversial terrain here, is that the American ruling class realizes that its biggest threat is having particularly working class blacks and whites work together to challenge capitalism, because the black chattering class and the media elite is proposing as a solution to Black America, black capitalism, as well as reparations, which, as we know, Preston Smith says that these are different types of race programs, and that at best, if were to work, would do nothing but basically be a wealth transfer to the black elite or the black upper middle class, while the black poor and working class would be ground to powder. What do you think, of Professor Wolff, of the contemporary discourse of race? I call it the age of wokeism and the racial grievance discourse, and how race is being used today in American society intentionally to dislodge in the minds of Black Americans that socialism and class-based policy is the answer to your problem. As you said, federal jobs guarantee, things of that nature. But instead, we need black capitalism and reparations, which, by all accounts, would be a wealth transfer to the black middle class. Assuming you agree, that's at best what it would be.
And I'll add to that things like the 1619 Project that kind of place slavery as almost inherently the evil that white men do, and take away the entire labor issue that, you know, people like Marx and even W.B. Du Bois talks about in his Reconstruction, a great work, Reconstruction.
Well, I don't want to keep saying the same thing. I don't want to irritate people, but for me, there's really nothing more that I know how to say than this. The focus upon race in all of those things that Pascal, you just listed, is for me, I don't know, a proverbial red flag. It's playing into the hands of the right wing, which will go to the white working class and say, once upon a time, the big white man on the hill was our friend, helping us and sticking it to the African American community. But now bad politicians have come in, and they're going to play the reverse game. They're going to buy off the African Americans, make a deal with them at our expense. And we can't let that happen. We have to fight back and make sure that we are the favored partner for the big white guy at the top who runs this show. And that becomes 99% a struggle against African Americans, pitting these two working classes in a position of competing for the favor from the top. Who gets reparations and who gets budgets cut? Who gets to be in the black middle class at the expense of what? Of the decline of whatever little hope working whites had that they might make it into the middle class. Here's a reality I would urge on people to think about. This is a system that doesn't work anymore. I've never seen American capitalism, and I was born many years ago. I was born in a place called Youngstown, Ohio, a disaster zone of American capitalism, if you ever wanted to see one. I've never seen the American economy in as deep trouble as it is now. Let me tell you a story briefly. I went to all the fancy schools in this country. I went to Harvard, then I went to Stanford, and I finished at Yale. I'm like a joke, 10 years of my life in the Ivy League. And so I know all these folks. My classmate at Yale, it was a small class, 15 kids. One of my classmates at Yale was Janet Yellen, right? So she was sitting next to me. We learned the same economics from the same professors in the same curriculum in the same classroom. I know these people, and because we became friends, some of them, as I went through school, we occasionally get together for a cup of coffee or dinner or something. And here's what you might find interesting. I certainly do. We do not agree on how the United States got into the current set of difficulties it has. And we do not agree on how to get out of them. But here is something we agree on that surprised all of us. The following sentence we are all agreed to. This is the worst condition of the American economy in our lifetimes. There are no ways out. We are 4.5% of the world's people, and we just had 20% of the world's deaths from COVID. We can't even prevent a public health disaster that countries with infinitely less resources were able to do an infinitely better job of preparing for and coping. We just lost a war in Afghanistan. We've already lost the one in Iraq. It just hasn't been announced yet. We were defeated in Vietnam years ago. Our military is an overbloated, overloaded, incapable machine absorbing ridiculous amounts of money. Our infrastructure is so badly neglected. Well, let me give you an example. One of the most important boosts to productivity, to making production cheaper, and therefore making a country more efficient, is high-speed railway. In the world today, 2/3 of all high-speed rail is in one country, the People's Republic of China. The United States has a trivial amount. It calls it high speed, basically the Boston-Washington corridor, but it isn't as high as what is normal in many other countries. We're falling behind. We have, for the first time in a century, a real serious economic competitor in the People's Republic of China. And a little statistic: over the last 25 years, the average rate of growth of the economy of the United States has been 2 to 3% GDP per year. Over the exact same period, the GDP growth in the People's Republic of China has been 6 to 9%. The country is growing year in and year out 3 times faster. The average real wage of a Chinese worker has quadrupled in the last 25 years. It has gone nowhere in the United States. I mean, I should stop here, although I could go on for hours. We're not number one anymore. And I know that that's difficult. And I know it's hard for a population to get its head around that. We're watching the British Empire. Those people over there, half of them still believe that there's something more than a small secondary economic power off the coast of Europe. It's hard to go down. It was much easier on the way up. But the American economy, as it is pinched on all sides, it will use its class structure to offload the pain, the costs, the difficulties of being on the down by loading them on to those below them in the pecking order. The whites who are rich onto the whites who are the middle, the whites who are in the middle to the whites who are below them, the blacks in the middle onto the blacks below them, and the tensions are going to rise, and the conflict, and the basic question which Americans can't even get their heads around is how are you going to apportion the difficulties and the pain of this? It's not going to go away. You're not going to have a policy that solves this problem until you recognize that it's the problem you have. You're not going to have infrastructure adequate in this country, even if Mr. Biden got his $3.5 trillion, which he has no chance to get because of Democrats, by the way. The Republicans, of course, are gone, but he'll never get it. But the point is, the Republicans and the Democrats neglected infrastructure for so many years that $3.5 trillion, which sounds like a lot, isn't anywhere near what you need. And this country is going to be facing this kind of sequential dead end. And if you don't face that, it's a little bit like climate. If you don't face that, it ain't going away. It's not going to solve itself.
You're a popular guy.
I'm sorry about that.
It's okay. You're a popular guy. But we're hitting an hour anyway. But there is one question I do have for you. And I totally understand if you say no. For the about 2 years I've been doing this, I have amassed a very nice Rolodex of Marxist economists. Would you be down to come back at some point in the future and we can have an economist roundtable and we can have you guys bash it out?
Absolutely. There's nothing more important to me, really, just between you two and me, than having these conversations in public so these ideas get out there, that people can hear them, think about them, decide this part is right, that part is wrong. So the answer is yes, I'd be glad to do it.
Well, we'd be glad to have you. Thank you guys for joining us. Are we going to do a bonus patron half on this, Pascal, you and I, when this airs?
It's up to you.
What if we just did a call in?
Yeah, we could have a call in.
Oh, wow, that sounds like a nightmare. All right. Well, I'm going to play the outro music and try to figure out exactly how to avoid the nightmare of a call-in show.